Donald Trump just announced he wants to create a 50-year mortgage. So the question becomes, will this make home prices go up, down? Will it make housing more affordable? Well, I can assure you one thing, it doesn't end well. I'm going to reveal all of the consequences and the likely unintended consequences in 3 simple fast steps. Step number 1, George, you can't even be serious. You've got to be joking. A 50-year mortgage? No, it's actually true. Editor, I'm sure you've been throwing up a lot of these headlines, but throw up the tweet of Donald Trump comparing himself to FDR. Now, I didn't even realize this, but it doesn't surprise me that FDR was the one that created the 30-year mortgage. So why not Donald Trump, the 50-year mortgage? And by the way, ever since Trump became president, I've always said he's a big government guy. He wants to expand the role of government in the real economy. And I always compared him to FDR. I said he was the FDR 2.0. So it comes as no surprise to see Donald Trump comparing himself to none other than FDR. But let's get right back to it here. We've got a chart, and this is a fascinating chart. It's the mortgage payment. So let's focus on the mortgage payments adjusted for inflation. Very important, because we want to see the home price affordability. Then we'll layer over the top home prices. So this chart goes to about 2023. It's not up to date, but you get the concept. We go back to 1972. On the left, we go from $1,000 up to $3,500. Now, initially, I want you to focus on this red line. This represents the monthly mortgage payment, or the average monthly mortgage payment adjusted for inflation. So going back to 1971, 72, look at this. Right around $1,300, $1,400. That is incredible. And then in 1980, it balloons all the way up to $3,500. Why is that? Did home prices skyrocket adjusted for inflation? Not really. It was more so about the interest rates. But then interest rates came crashing down along with the average mortgage payment adjusted for inflation. But then we kind of get this plateau. Now, this is the first kind of part of this chart that I really want you to focus on. Because what happened here in the mid-90s is the home prices, adjusted for inflation, started to go higher and higher and higher. That's represented by this black line. Now, this isn't exact. I just drew this in based on memory. But editor, go and throw up a chart of home prices adjusted for inflation, and we can see that they're pretty much flat going all the way back to the late 1890s. But then what happened is the central planners, the politicians, came in with all of these schemes to make housing more affordable. Sound familiar? And then home prices shot up. So if we would not have had all of that financial engineering, that's a key phrase here that I want you to remember, then we would have seen the average mortgage payment likely go all the way down to where it was here, very consistent with where it was in the 1970s, or the early 1970s. Now, before we move any further, I want to go through a quick thought experiment with you guys. You know what mortgage payments have done recently. Here's where we are, roughly 2023, probably higher now in 2025. But that's at about $3,500 a month. So think about this. What would the average American's disposable income be? In other words, the amount of money they were able to save, the amount of money they were able to invest. What would happen to their living standard if we took the average mortgage payment from $3,500 all the way down to even call it $1,500, where it was in the early 1970s? That's an additional $2,000 a month. So my point is, without astronomically high interest rates, let's just say if the overnight rate with Fed funds is around 5% or 6%, just kind of where it was at the beginning of the 1970s, you would expect the free market would create enough supply of homes to bring that mortgage payment down to where it was. But notice, it didn't go down to where it was. It only went down to, say, $2,000 or a little above $2,000. That was a result of financial engineering by the central planners. So instead of home prices becoming more affordable, what they replaced it with is home prices skyrocketing and turning into a bubble. So although people's standard of living wasn't increasing because they had more disposable income, they didn't care because they thought their standard of living was increasing because their home equity was going up because the price was going up. But we all know how that ended. This was a complete illusion, and then the bubble popped, and we went all the way back down to, where do you think? Where we were in the early 1970s, which means where we should have been all along, assuming that the interest rates stayed the same. So I'm kind of going out of order here. I started with number 2, but now let's go up to number 1, because the argument here that Donald Trump is trying to make is that we have to make housing more affordable. Okay, but he doesn't want to make housing more affordable by bringing home prices down, because a lot of the people that vote for him and vote for Republicans that he wants to get elected own homes. And they don't want their home price to go down. Absolutely not. They just want everyone else's home price to go down. So as a politician and a central planner, a big government guy, he's got to figure out some sort of financial engineering, again, the buzz phrase there for this video, to make housing more affordable without bringing prices down. But the only way that we can do this is by creating these distortions that create massive, massive bubbles and, by the way, social unrest. We'll get into that more in just a moment, probably in step number 3. But the real way to make housing more affordable in a way that actually benefits society at large over the long run is to add supply. Add supply. And that's going to bring home prices down. That's going to bring mortgage payments down, assuming that the interest rate stays the same. And I wanted to highlight rents right now. Editor, go ahead and throw up a chart, and we can see that month over month, rents have actually been coming down over the past, say, 3 or 4 months. And if this trend continues, we could see rents coming down on an annual basis. Well, why on earth are rents coming down? Why on earth are rents becoming more affordable? Well, it is true that we have an issue with demand because the labor market is deteriorating, but we had massive supply that was created in 2021 and 2022 in the multi-family space. Now that will likely blow up as far as the shadow banks and the regional banks themselves. We'll save that topic for a completely separate video. But the bottom line here is you're bringing rents down. You're making them more affordable because of an increase of supply. So if we want to figure out how to make housing ownership more affordable, the only way to really do it in a way that's going to accrue a net benefit to the average American is if you increase the supply. But Donald Trump doesn't want that because that means prices will come down. But unfortunately, we've only hit the tip of the iceberg as far as the unintended consequences that would likely be a result of a 50-year mortgage. We're going to get into those unintended consequences right now. Step number 2. Now let's go over to a mortgage calculator and see how a 50-year mortgage would actually impact your monthly payment, and maybe more importantly, impact the amount of interest you have to pay and the amount of equity you're building year over year. So I just used the default settings with this mortgage calculator. So home value, $400,000. You guys can see what we're dealing with here as far as the numbers. So I'm going to go ahead and it actually auto calculates. So we can see the total monthly payment. We're at $2,289. Now, over the life of this 30-year mortgage, you're going to pay $369,000 worth of interest. Now let's go up here to the top where you can see the first year, the total interest payments are right around $19,000, and your total payments that actually go to principal, or the total amount of your payments that go to principal, right around $4,000. Now we're going to go all the way out to 2035 and see how that changes. So in 2035, 35, you've got the total of your annual payments. $16,000 is going to interest, and almost $7,000 is going to principal. Now, I want you guys to make a mental note or just write that down. In 2035, about $7,000 of your annual payments are going to principal. In other words, building your equity, building your ownership in the actual house. And remember, we had $369,000 in total interest payments over the span of the entire mortgage. Now, let's go ahead and type in 50 years into the term of the actual loan and see how these numbers change. So first and foremost, we have a monthly payment of $2,054. So great, it comes down by about $200. But now we get into the total interest paid. Remember, the other was $369. Now we're at $687,000 in interest paid over the span of this loan. Oh, but wait, there is more. Now let's go up and see how much equity you're building. So right off the bat, if we take all your annual payments, $19,000 is going to interest, and only $1,000 is going to principal. Now let's go out to 2035 like we did last time, and look at this. It's still $18,000 going to interest and only $1,800 going to principal. So basically, this mortgage is like renting. You didn't really buy the house. You're just renting the house under the illusion of home ownership. And let's not forget, if you bring the monthly payment down to $2,000 for a $400,000 house, what's going to happen? Well, you're going to have more buyers, and they're just going to bid up the price of the house. So now you've got the exact same house with the exact same mortgage payment, but just with a higher price. So you don't do anything to quote unquote affordability, but you just turn people into medieval serfs through the illusion of home ownership. I don't know, maybe the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab were talking about a 50-year mortgage when they said you'll own nothing and you will be happy. Well, they got the you'll own nothing part correct, that's for sure. But as far as you'll be happy, that's something I highly, highly doubt. And we're going to get into why right now. Step number 3. So now let's go over my prediction as to whether this 50-year mortgage will increase prices, decrease prices, or improve home affordability. Or maybe better said, improve the standard of living, because at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. Well, my answer here is it depends. It depends on what's happening in the real economy. So let me give you an example. Let's assume everything stays the same. So the labor market does not continue to deteriorate. We do not go into a recession. The unemployment rate does not spike. And interest rates also stay the same. Well, in this case, the payments would likely flatline. I've got this red line right there extending out. I don't think the monthly payment would really go down because of what we talked about in step number 2, where if you bring in more buyers, you're just going to increase the price. And at the end of the day, the mortgage payment is going to go right back to where it was. Now, the price, and that's represented by this black line, remember, flat lines. Now you say, George, well, I thought you just said that the price would go up. Yeah, but remember, in a 50-year mortgage, you're basically renting. So even if the price does go up, you don't really accrue a benefit to that because you don't own the house unless you sell. But now let's think about what would happen if we go into a recession. The unemployment rate spikes, the labor market continues to deteriorate, we have a decrease in aggregate demand. Then what happens to home prices? They likely go down. Now, the good news here is that the mortgage payment would also go down as well. But would that increase the standard of living? My answer is no. Here's why. Let's go back. There's the same chart, if you didn't notice, that we used in step number 1. And remember, the standard of living, just looking at it through this framework, was incredibly high at the beginning of the 1970s. Why? Because they had that additional $2,000 of monthly disposable income adjusted for inflation versus what the average American has today. But then interest rates go up, they come back down. Now, when the interest rates came back down to where they were here, notice the standard of living didn't go back to these high levels. And again, we're just looking at through the framework of these mortgage payments adjusted for inflation. They only went down to medium. Why? Because that's when the central planners and the politicians came in with their financial engineering schemes. Now, when I'm talking about financial engineering, just to be clear, I'm talking about something that occurs that is not driven by the free market. As an example, 0% down mortgages is not something you would see in the free market. Liar loans is not something that you would see in the free market because the banks would have to keep those loans on their balance sheet as opposed to pawning them off on Fannie and Freddie. So again, to be clear here, when I'm talking about financial engineering, I'm talking about all of these incentives and this environment that is created by the politicians and the central planners that is completely removed and divorced from free market capitalism. Okay, so getting back to this here, the result of all of this means that home prices go up. So, well, that's great news because although the monthly payments didn't go back down to where they should have been, the home equity, the prices were going up, so the standard of living was again high. But remember, this is all artificial. So what happens is the bubble pops, prices go back down. Now remember that the monthly payment went back down as well, but was the standard of living here high? Was the standard of living higher in 2012 than it was in 2006? Absolutely not. Well, why? Because the monthly payments went down. Because the central planners built everything, or this standard of living, around home prices being in an artificial bubble. So when the bubble pops and the prices go back down, the standard of living on net balance decreases substantially. So now we go into where we are today, where the standard of living, although home prices have gone up, is still extremely low because now those payments have gone up as well. So my point here is if the payments go back down as a result of another crash, that isn't going to improve the standard of living. It just decreases the standard of living for the people who own the homes, and then it increases the standard of living slightly for the home buyers. But I would argue it might not even increase their standard of living because the unemployment rate skyrockets and it becomes harder and harder to get a job to qualify for a loan to buy a house to begin with. So the main point here is because of this central planning and politicians being politicians, we're in a position that regardless of what happens in the housing market, the standard of living, looking at it through this framework, remains extremely low. And what have we seen over the last, let's say, 10 years? We've seen the standard of living go down. We've seen homelessness go up. We've seen drug use go up. We have seen social unrest increase. So basically what Donald Trump is doing by trying to implement this is he's just trying to exacerbate the problems that have increased over the last 10 years as a result of this way back here to begin with. So the next question becomes, understanding all this and then understanding the fact that private credit's deteriorating, shadow banking is blowing up, and we're in a massive bubble in the stock market and a massive bubble in the housing market, what do you do to protect your wealth? How do you position yourself? How do you set up your portfolio? On this note, I've got some good news. I have a private investing community called Rebel Capitalist Pro with my good friends Chris McIntosh, Brent Johnson, and many others, where we help retail investors navigate these tumultuous times. If you want to find out more about Rebel Capitalist Pro, we'll put a link in the description below.